All right, so what I've got here, I grabbed the first five CTE sets of courses, and then I just regraphed them in Excel because I wanted to take kind of a look at where these benchmark and critical thresholds are. So according to the measures that we still have to use through this fall, the benchmark threshold is 13 students per section. That's what that looks like. And then the critical threshold is 6 students per section. And this is all based on a percent of an average of all the CTE courses. Now, just a reminder, remembering back to the idea of thresholds, any program getting 3 or more benchmark threshold trips gets a letter. And any program getting 1 critical threshold trip gets a letter, okay? And one of the concerns, I want to bring up thresholds multiple times over all these videos. One of the big concerns I have is I understand that you can trip a benchmark threshold and be okay. But very often what's going to happen is programs aren't just going to trip 1 because the thing that's tripping them in 1 is also going to trip them in another. For example, just looking at something like culinary or bakery, which is tripping the benchmark threshold, they're probably also getting hit in the cost over revenue, because if the students per section is down, that means their cost per revenue is up. So it's kind of a double whammy. So I want you to put that in the back of your mind too when we think about thresholds and a fair way of creating thresholds. Okay, now my concern too is when you look at these 5 groups of courses, left to right, they're not wildly going up and going down and going up and going down. As a matter of fact, they're staying fairly consistent left to right. And when I started really looking at these lines, I began to realize something. When you have time-specific data like this, what a lot of quality control engineers look at is not some kind of arbitrary line in the sand that gets drawn, but instead something called a control chart. Let me show you what I mean with a control chart applied to business administration. Okay, so what I did here was I just left the business administration average students per section up, but I added these 2 little orange lines. Now these orange lines here are called upper and lower control limits. Engineers use them all the time to help them monitor processes to make sure that things aren't getting too crazy out of control, like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge or something like that. Now, how did those lines get there? Well, I added them using a pretty standard statistical procedure. I took the average and standard deviation of business administration's 5-year average students per section. So I took the average of those 5 numbers and the standard deviation of those 5 numbers, and then using the old statistical principle of plus or minus 2 standard deviations, I threw those lines up there. I don't want to get too lost in the math right now. We can always talk more about the math in the meetings, and I'd be happy to go into as much detail as possible. But the idea is that those 2 lines belong to business administration and only to business administration. That means instead of comparing business administration to this somewhat arbitrary 75% of the average of all the CTE classes, compare it to itself. Because business administration's classes are always going to be above that CTE threshold. Let's take a second now and also add in baking. Okay, so now I've added in culinary. I lied to you, I said baking, I meant culinary. And its upper and lower control limits. These are based, remember, these are based on culinary's performance, not the total average performance of all CTE programs. One of the big concerns, I want to say it again and actually put it in writing here, is that if we use the average of all CTE programs, small programs are always going to trip this benchmark. There's just no way, no matter how you adjust that percentage, your smallest programs are going to trip it. What you're looking for is you're looking for obvious kind of out of control changes within a department. What better way to measure that than by looking at how the department is doing over time? When you look at it this way, culinary is not fluctuating at all. It's staying within its control limits. Think of it as the sides of the road when a car is going down the sides of the road. Okay, the car can move a little bit to the left and a little bit to the right as long as it stays in the lanes of its road. These control limits do the exact same thing. They measure over time the performance of a department, in this case, average students per section. So long as we're staying consistently within those limits, that means the department is operating as it always has, as opposed to putting up something like this, which is an arbitrarily set value that a program like culinary is always going to come in below. It can't make a goal that it's physically impossible for it to make, but it can maintain the goals that it's already set for itself over time.